The VersaRack is a versatile tub and shelving enclosure system that can accommodate tubs of different sizes with only minor changes in parts and their orientation. Therefore, the assembly steps for each rack are basically the same. This video tutorial will take you through the basic steps for building a VersaRack in the Hatchling, V28, V35, and V70 series, as well as the Sterilite Tub series. The minor differences between the types will be described in the video. The best way to use this tutorial is to watch the whole video without stopping to get a good overview of the process, then refer back to different sections of the video as needed when you are building the rack. The diagrams that will arrive with your specific VersaRack will show the positions of parts specific to that rack. The packing slip will list all the parts that are shipped with the order, and the numbers of each part that you should have received. Unpack the boxes and make an inventory of the parts using the packing list. Each system will have the same types of parts, but the sizes and numbers of those parts may vary. Here is an overview of the parts. Vertical poles. These are the vertical supports for the rack. There are 3 types of threaded inserts in the ends of the poles. The 3/8 inch female. This small diameter threaded insert will receive the tightening bolts at the top of the rack and the wheeled casters at the bottom of the rack. 22mm male. This threaded extension will be used to connect 2 vertical poles together in the middle of a rack. 22mm female. This insert will receive the 22mm male threaded extension when 2 vertical poles are connected. Spacers. The main spacers will define the distance between the shelves. The top spacers will be shorter and be installed at the top of the vertical poles. Shelves. The tubs will slide between the shelves in the rack. There are 2 sides to each shelf. The upper side of the shelf has depth and a network of plastic clips that will be used to hold the heat cable. The tubs will sit on top of this side of the shelf. The underside of the shelf is flat. The tops of the tubs will touch this side of the shelf. There are 2 sizes of shelves, the larger 34.5 inch long shelf and the shorter 26 inch long shelf. Your rack will use one or the other. Tightening bolts and washers. These pieces of hardware will be used at the top of the riser poles to hold the rack together and generate the pressure that will make the rack very solid. Guides and stops. These plastic pieces will be placed under a shelf to prevent the tub from being pushed out of the rack. There are 3 types of slide guides and stops. Flat guide stop. This is a flat, thin piece of plastic that will fit tightly into grooves on the underside of the shelf. Guide stop with rivets. This is a molded piece of plastic with holes to receive rivets that will secure the guide stop to the underside of the shelf. Front stop with nameplate. This is a sliding stop that will slide along the front of the tub and prevent it from being pulled from the rack. Wheeled castors. These castors are installed at the bottom of the rack so that it can be rolled. There are 2 types of castors, locking and non-locking. Tub. The tubs will be the enclosure for the animals and will slide between the shelves on the rack. There are many different tub sizes to choose from. Heat cable. The heat cable is installed in the clips molded into the top of each shelf and will provide heat for the animals in the tubs. Each VersaRack includes a 52-foot heat cable. The only tool you will need for the assembly is a 9/16 wrench or a small crescent wrench. The bolts on top of the wheeled casters will thread into 3/8 inch female threaded inserts in the end of the vertical poles. If your VersaRack is tall enough to need 2 pole sections that are connected in the middle, the small threaded insert will be in one end. The longer of the 2 poles is the bottom pole. If your VersaRack is short enough to not need 2 pole sections, both ends will have the small threaded inserts. It does not matter which end you use for the casters. Hand tighten 1 wheeled caster onto each of the poles and set them aside. The slide guide stops with rivets will be positioned on the underside of each shelf except for the lowest shelf, so that they are adjacent to the sides of the tubs or at the back of the tub to prevent it from being pushed out of the back of the rack. It is much easier to install the guide stops with rivets before the rack is assembled. The placement of the slide guide stops will be different for each size of tub. Refer to the drawing that will come with the instructions to see the exact positions for your rack. There are holes in the shelf to receive the fasteners for the slide guide stops with rivets. Position the holes in the guide stop over the holes in the shelf with the flat side of the guide stop against the shelf. Push the barbed fasteners through the holes until they are fully seated. This will require some force. Install all the slide guide stops onto all the shelves except for the bottom shelf. Pick up the shelf that does not have the slide guide stops installed on the underside. From the underside of the shelf, the flat side, insert the top of each vertical pole through the holes in the shelf and push the poles through the hole until the wheeled caster touches the shelf. Make sure that the locking casters are on the side of the shelf that you will be able to reach when the rack is placed where you want it to be. Lock the casters so that they will not roll around and set the rack on its wheels. Slip one main spacer onto each riser pole and slide it down to the top of the shelf. Pick up a shelf. They should all have the slide guides and stops with rivets installed, and rotate it so that the top is oriented the same as the top of the shelf that is already installed. The heat cable clips should be oriented the same way. Insert the tops of the vertical poles through the holes in the second shelf and push it down to the top of the spacers installed above the bottom shelf. Pushing the shelf down is easier with two people and will require some wiggling and gentle banging to get the shelf into position. It is important to not use excessive force. The shelves are very strong, but they are still plastic. After the second shelf is fully seated in place, install the next set of main spacers. Repeat the steps of installing shelves and spacers until they are all in place. Make sure that all the shelves are oriented the same. If you have a tall rack with two vertical poles that will connect in the middle, install all the shelves on the bottom poles first before installing the upper poles. The 22mm male thread extension of the upper pole will thread into the 22mm female threaded insert at the top of the bottom pole. Hand tighten all the upper poles into place and then finish adding the remaining shelves and spacers. Depending upon the type of rack system you have purchased, there may or may not be a small extension of vertical pole above the top shelf. If there is an extension, you will find a set of top spacers that will set above the shelf. These spacers are very important. Without them, the rack cannot be tightened. A few models will not have vertical poles extending above the top shelf and will not need top spacers. To tighten the rack, place a washer over the top of each vertical pole and insert a tightening bolt through it into the 3/8" female threaded insert in the top of the vertical pole. Hand tighten the bolt until you cannot tighten it anymore. Use a wrench to tighten the bolt until the main spacers between the shelves are hard to turn. There is no need to tighten the bolt any more than that, and over-tightening could damage the rack. Each Versa rack includes a heat cable that can be installed in the clips that are molded into the top of the shelves. The best practice is to install the cable under one end or side of the tub so that there is a temperature gradient within the tub. Heat rises. so the tubs at the top of the rack need less cable under them than the tubs at the bottom of the rack. Keep that in mind when you design the layout for your heat cable. Start with the end of the cable without the plug, and start with the shelf that will be under the uppermost tubs. Use a lot of clips, which will help secure the cable in place. The greater the amount of cable you put under the tubs, the warmer the tubs will be. Make sure to leave a little slack in the cable when you start on the next shelf, so there is less risk of catching the cable on the edge of a tub you're moving in or out of the rack. Try to leave enough cable at the bottom of the rack to reach an electrical outlet, or you will need to use an extension cord. The flat guide stops are pieces of plastic that are pushed into the channels on the underside of each shelf to prevent the tubs from being pushed out of the rack. Refer to the diagram that came with your specific rack to locate the channels that the flat guide stops slip into for your specific configuration. Slide the tubs into their positions on each shelf. Vision tubs will have an extended lip in the front of each tub. The back of the tub will be flat. The front of the rack and the number of tubs per shelf will be different for each type of rack. The diagram that came with your Versa rack will show you the arrangement of the tubs for your specific system. The sliding front stop has a channel that will slide onto the bracket on the front of the shelf. The channel on the front of the stop can be used to hold an identification placard. To pull the tub out from the rack, slide the front stop to the side. Roll your rack into place. Plug in the heat cable, lock the wheels, and now your Versa rack system is ready for animals. For more information about Vision racks and cages, please visit the CustomCages.com website. If you need to ask a question about your Versa rack, please use the contact comment form on the website or call our customer service department at 800-941-2243.